Welcome to the second Emerging Biotech Company Showcase, hosted virtually by NewYorkBIO and the New York Stock Exchange. The showcase brings together the financial community and a group of New York-based emerging biotech companies that are developing novel therapeutics and technologies that could revolutionize patient care. As part of the event, we're posting conversations with the leadership of these companies that gives more background and color behind the management team and their mission. Special thanks to our sponsors at Fox Rothschild, JP Morgan, Carta, Newmark Knight Frank, Solberry Trout, and of course, the New York Stock Exchange. Welcome to a deeper dive with Partick Doyle, CEO of Stelexis. All right, Patrick, it is wonderful to have you here. And thank you so much for you and Stelexis being part of our emerging company showcase with the New York Stock Exchange. I'm excited to start some of these interviews because it allows us to give a little more of an angle of where your company came from and where you came from, and give our audience a little bit more of an inside look into the vision behind the company and the things that got the company where it is today. So in that vein, I wanted to start with a little bit of your background and how you got here. You know, what were some of the biggest influences on your career, and how did you get to where you are today?
Well, that's a lot. Thank you, Derek, and thanks for you and NewYorkBIO and the New York Stock Exchange. I'm happy to take part in the event and represent Stelexis. So yeah, that's a lot of things to ask for. I mean, in terms of my background, I'm obviously from the UK, as you can hear. I studied in the UK. I studied pharmacology and postdoced in Geneva Medical School for some years, where at one point I was like pretty much a sort of diehard academic, saying I'd never go to industry, until I realized the way in which industry can approach certain problems. And I had the luck of meeting Bruce Carter and Mads Thompson from Novo Nordisk in the mid-90s, and visiting Novo Nordisk in Copenhagen, and seeing, you know, what industry can do in terms of numbers and budget and real volume. And you've got 700 PhD, well, I don't know if they're all PhDs, but 700 researchers working on diabetes, for example. You're like, wow, when you've come from an academic group of 8 people and you're struggling to get a grant. And so I had my eyes opened quite significantly, moving to Novo Nordisk and spending 5 years in Denmark, getting more and more into the industry sort of approach to science, and then having my eyes really opened when I started going to the CEO talks at Novo, when he was talking more about, you know, the amount of money made by Forex compared to the amount of insulin sales, and some of the sort of context of the role business plays in the science application, and not ever forgetting, of course, the role of the patient in all this. And so I really sort of started to get into the idea and understanding that business was pretty much dictating the direction sometimes that the science was going in these companies, and there's a reality to that. And if you get the business end right, in terms of the patient need, and don't forget the patient need, then it can be quite a powerful approach. And that's something I really had, I wouldn't say hammered into me, but I really loved learning in Novo, because Novo's, you know, fantastic company, very flat organization, very consensus-driven Danish style. The second market is Japan, not surprisingly. So I had a lot of experience in Japan and the way of doing business in Japan, and didn't really get much exposure in the US. And so after 5 years in Denmark, I knew there was some changes occurring in Roche, or Roche as you call it, in Basel, and moved to Basel in 2000 to get sort of more primarily into corporate development and business development. Mm-hmm. And that was like a natural progression for me, because I've become from a very specialized scientific sort of focus on type 2 diabetes, obesity, feeding regulation, into a milieu where I could be therapy area and disease agnostic, but apply all the basic tenets of what makes good science and fitting well with good business into sort of a business development activity. And when I got to Roche in 2000, Brad Bolson had just arrived, and the group were 2-3 people after sort of like a major clear out. And the group grew to just over 60 people in the space of 2 years. Wow. And this is whole business development, licensing, alliance management, want, get, find, sort of strategy making, and on a global basis. And having the backing of the CEO to go out and double the pipeline in the space of 4 years really gave that group the ability to challenge the whole R&D model in the pharma sort of context. And I loved it. I mean, my feet didn't touch the ground for 4 years, literally going from early startup phases through to, some of the things that really got me going, from making the first investment in Genmab, for example, and making that collaboration work so well that when Genmab was really a startup, to making the Chugai acquisition work and integrating the entire pipeline through Genentech and Roche on a sort of more global basis. And all of the time when I was doing that, there was this fantastic mantra within Roche, similar to the Novo, where you never forget the patient. And the fact you never forget the patient really means a lot to me, because if the science makes sense and it's exciting and it's interesting, and you can see there's a business translation to that science, then it's evidently going to benefit a patient group. And that's something sorry, go on. Yeah.
I was going to say, there's always a point where you look at how capital and transactions can really be transformative when you're looking at deals that are really focused on either single assets or single pieces of biology, or things that can really be transformative for one facet of asset development innovation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so, I mean, in terms of what brought me here and how that sort of evolution occurred, was I got to the 5th year in Roche, and when that whole department had actually doubled the pipeline in 4 years. I spent a year with Jonathan Knowles looking at different early stage companies for acquisition, taking part in the Research and Development Council in Roche from phase 2 development onwards. And having spent so many years on the pharma side of the table, seeing biotechs come and be evaluated, I was running due diligence for a couple of years. So you really, all the, I wouldn't say tricks, but all the questions that pharma needs to have answered. It turned out that about a year after Brad had left, I got a call saying there's a diabetes company in California. Do you want to come and take part in that? It's a great exposure for biotech. You can't go wrong, sort of thing. And I jumped at the chance. I just jumped at the opportunity to take that as a natural next step. And so from 2005 onwards, I've been taking part in biotechs from the phase 2/3 stage down earlier and earlier and earlier in the value chain over the last, particularly over the last 10 years, going from earlier and earlier and earlier to Stelexis, which when I got involved with Stelexis was really a slide deck. And so I can talk about that separately, but that was basically like a European and US West Coast CEO, CBO roles I played between San Francisco, San Diego, Switzerland, and back now to New York.
So why don't we talk a little bit about the overarching vision that brought you to Stelexis? What were some of the major thing, even if it was just a slide deck, what were some of the major things that made you look at it and say, yeah, I think this can work?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, when this is something that always, excites me somewhat is, and this isn't like a regular occurrence, obviously. So there are so many approaches that don't ring necessarily your personal bell. But that happened with me with Stelexis. So the founder group of Uli Steidl, Amit Verma, Everest Gavathiotis, and Roman Peresola from Einstein College of Medicine had all been working in leukemia for many years. And they basically approached their overarching tenet of the whole approach was that when you target the bulk tumor in diseases like AML, you maybe miss the original drivers that drive relapse and recurrence in those diseases. Mm-hmm. And that's something that a lot of people, recognize, but they actually went to a lot of bother to take patient samples of blood and bone marrow from, excuse me, AML patients of different stages of disease. And this is historical sort of academic group work, but taking those samples and carrying out AFI-chip messenger RNA gene transcription comparisons to age-matched controls, and came up with a Venn diagram to show that there were a number of really clear early overexpressions of either receptors or excuse me, cytokines that were occurring in cells that have been sorted to be pre-leukemic and leukemic stem cells. And they developed a whole hypothesis around the fact that if you target the bulk tumors, you would do, for example, with chemotherapy, it's very effective the first time, but the second time, because you've missed those early changes that occur in the pre-leukemic stem cell space, you can't overcome the relapse. And that was something that was set out on a slide deck that I received and saw. And, first of all, the whole hypothesis that you're missing the point really appeals to me, because it's represents a paradigm shift in patient therapy. And which for me is like, that's the first point where you say, this is interesting. This is challenging the current way of thinking. and there's some data to support it. And all of this data was created by an academic group using primary cell samples. And most people know when they've been working in the lab that when you have a primary sort of cell approach, it's a mad scramble when you get the tissue or you get the primary specimen from your patient sample or your patient itself. There's a mad scramble in the lab, and then maybe 2 days later, most of the primary samples have either gone or they just, because they don't survive.
Right.
And so the thing that really appealed to me was the grouping of Uli Steidl and Emmy Verma's group with Derek Rossi from Boston Children's Hospital. And Derek Rossi is obviously like a very prominent founder. He founded Moderna, Magenta. I mean, Derek's quite a significant person when it comes to being taken seriously on his ideas. And what I liked very much about the stories, the way they told it to me, was that when Uli and his team were taking their primary samples and really scrambling for a very small cell number to investigate, Derek's comment was, imagine if you could keep those cells suspended in their stemness, and then you could really investigate them on a longer term. And so Derek had spent many years being able to do that and developing what we call the Rossi cocktail to enable stemness to be maintained in hematopoietic stem cells. And the idea would be to translate that into the leukemic stem cell so you could sort of ruggedize that whole approach and investigate it much deeper. And there I saw like a blue sky. You know, it wasn't, there's nothing particularly formulated in terms of where you could take that. But my first couple of thoughts when we're starting the company was, imagine if you could do that for other cell types, including solid tumors. And then you have the whole novel target discovery aspect associated with that. So that's what really excited me. And it was really a mixture of interest very high when you read in 2-dimension, your own sitting in front of your computer, looking at the slide deck, being taken into a 3-dimensional excitement when you meet the founder group all together. And there's this sort of buzzy atmosphere of ping-ponging around ideas in a room, which happened shortly after that. And I was like, I'm all in.
Basically. Yeah, and it doesn't take a lot to think about what a platform like this would mean for patients, right? You know, we talk a lot about where things have come in the last few years, but this is certainly something that could verge on, you know, curative therapy in a lot of ways, and have incredibly long duration, and think about what that means for cancer patients.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so we should talk a little bit about coming from, you know, California to New York, because you've now been here for 3 years. And, you know, I wondered what kind of preconceptions you might have had about New York City coming in, and really what some of your big takeaways on the ecosystem are, having been here for a few years now.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. So when I was talking to Peter Steelman from Deerfield, you know, you don't really associate New York as being a center of biotech. I mean, especially when you're sitting in your microcosm of San Francisco or even the microcosm of San Diego. I mean, you really, you know, don't really tend to see much beyond there. And I wasn't really aware of what was happening in New York. And so I was a little cautious, let's say it like that, because, you know, San Francisco is San Francisco, but it's historically been the center of biotech. I've spent many years there and loved it. But there's also like you know, it is like a microcosm, actually, from my perspective. So I wasn't too bothered by that. I was really eager to find out what was going on. Yeah. And a really good and trusted friend of mine, you know, who's one of the lawyer team when I was at Roche together. He's been working in the Alexandria Center for a while. I used to visit the Alexandria Center when I was just coming out of Roche, or just following up with people I used to know there. So I knew there were, you know, I knew about the presence of that center. What I didn't know about was the vision that Deerfield had for the way that they wanted to make an impact on biotech in New York. And that really pricked up my ears when I started to hear that in more detail, and started to really listen to the vision that Jim Flynn had and some of the other partners had at Deerfield. That made me very interested and quite frankly, quite sort of, you know, relaxed about making a move.
Well, they've been a huge player in this ecosystem for a long time, and, you know, having folks like Jim and like Karen Heidelberger, who's on NewYorkBIO's board, behind that, we're really excited about what they're doing with Cure, and really about what we think this means for New York City. From a fundraising standpoint, it's got to be a huge advantage to have people like that in your corner, not only with the vision, but with their history of putting companies together and really kind of having the clout where you can say, yeah, I have someone in my corner that can actually help me get this technology to patients if we're fortunate enough to get there.
Yeah, I mean, their experience and depth of breadth of abilities, amazing. I mean, so I spent some months working with them very closely with the famous slide deck, but with the founders and also the partners there, basically just hashing out what would be a clever 3-4 year plan. And that, that's when you start to recognize who you're dealing with, and you get very comfortable with the fact you've got a really experienced group of people. And one of the additional benefits on top of all of that, I mean, of course, there's the sticker, there's the name, there's the funding ability, but the experience, people like Bob Jackson and some of the others around the table is priceless. And then when you put that into context of, the Deerfield operational support. So I come from, a very small incubator group in La Jolla, where, that incubator offered operational support. And I'm not dissing it in the slightest. I'm just talking about like how things can be relativized. And that operational support was basically somebody helping with an Excel sheet for your budget, which is, helpful when you're in that n equals 2 people mode. Right? But when you get to the point where you have a Deerfield operational support, we haven't had to hire in any of the usual G&A functions or any of the support functions. So everything from controller, or more like mini CFO, HR, legal, BD, like really seriously well-equipped functions that can offer everything from top to bottom, and they do, is something that I really rely on. And I love that because we have 12 people in the company, 11 which are full-on scientists.
Yep.
And the rest is accessing a sort of plug and play part of the Deerfield operations team. And they know their own operations inside out. They know how their fund works. So everything clicks together pretty well. I mean, it's quite amazing when it's all working in action.
Yeah, that's great. And it should allow you really to kind of put your head down and look at where you have to go from the standpoint of where is the science going? How do I actually kind of steer this ship so that, you're one step closer to bringing medicines to patients?
Yeah, absolutely. It does. It just means you can focus on strategy much more than you normally have to be putting out fires in every other area. And it's not the case.
Yeah, well, this is fantastic. I'm excited that you're going to be a part of this event, and I think we can close things out with, maybe perhaps a little vision from you on really the impact that you think Stelexis can have on patients and where you'd like to see things go in the next few years.
Oh, thanks, Derek. No, I mean, I'm a pleasure to take part as well. I mean, the way we look at Stelexis is overcoming relapse and recurrence, primarily in AML. I mean, that's our first and foremost raison d'etre as a company. But where I really see the company going mid to longer term would be overcoming relapse or overcoming resistance in other types of cancers. And that's the exciting upside of the whole application for a more broader patient group, but certainly, really targeting and identifying the relapse drivers is primarily in our minds for AML patients right now.
Yeah, well, that's fantastic. Again, we're really happy to have you here. Look forward to hearing from you at the stock exchange in a couple of weeks. And thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Derek.
Okay. All right. Thank you for joining us on a deeper dive with Partick Doyle. We're looking forward to the Emerging Biotech Company Showcase on December 9th. Look for more information on www.newyorkbio.org and follow us on Twitter @NewYorkBIO.